I'm Addison Brazil. Grief Club, the podcast, starts now. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Grief Club, the podcast. My name's Addison Brazil, and this is our show where we take parts of my book, First Year of Grief Club, A Gift from a Friend Who Gets It, and use the chapters and experiments as launching points for deeper conversations with friends and experts. This week in the book that we're using to launch off of is the week where I talked about the first time about assessing who's supporting you and who's in your support circle, whether it be peer or professional support. And we're going to dig into that lots today. So I thought, who better to bring on than someone who's the opposite of me? As you guys know, I'm an everyday guy. I'm not a coach. I'm not a doctor. I'm just the guy across the grief arena smiling and, offering you what's worked for me. So I thought, who better to bring in than Dr. Mark Shelvock to talk about what it's like to be on the other side of that, which is a professional, a mental health professional. So welcome to the show.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's a great honor and pleasure to be here. And let me just say, Addison, I really appreciate the grief advocacy work that you do in this field because we need everyday people talking about everyday grief and loss experiences.
Amazing. Yes. And I have no intention of going to medical school anytime soon. So I will be over here on the everyday side for the foreseeable future. So one thing I like to do just before we get going is a conscious emotional check-in. So I just have the guests take a deep breath with me. And then in one word, describe how you are feeling physically.
Excited.
I'm gonna say jittery. I feel like I use that one a lot. In one word, how are you feeling mentally?
I feel so many things at once that it's hard to put it to pick one word. I guess, yes, I would feel a little jittery physically, a little bit excited emotionally.
There you go. So you're
Yeah.
intertwining mentally and emotionally. I was going to ask you emotionally next. Um, but yeah, no, I'm excited. I mean, leave it to the psychotherapist to have just too many options and feelings to
Yeah.
really narrow it down to one. Um, yeah, lovely. I just like to do that. I always think it's great to know sort of where we're coming from, and also it prompts our listeners to take that minute for themselves too and just breathe and figure out where you're coming from in this moment. Is that the way that you say that? This is a great time to forget just how to speak English, when you're hosting your podcast. Um, as you can see, we're not
We
afraid
all
to
know what you
laugh
mean.
here. Exactly. So I usually like to give the guests the opportunity to sort of honor their journey for a few minutes openly. I could read your bio, or I always figured there's, that more intimate opportunity for you to just talk about yourself, how you got to show up the way you do in the world today. You can honor your own grief processes within it or not. That's totally up to you. But yeah, what is honoring your journey would look like?
Sure. Yeah, I can share a little bit about me. So I got into this work because of my own lived experience of suffering, which I feel like is important to name. And that's a really common experience for a lot of people who decide to pursue professional work in this field of grief and bereavement and loss and everything relating to dying and death and trauma and so forth. And it's through our own lived experience of suffering that often brings us here. And so for me, at the ripe age of 20, I experienced a full-blown existential quarter-life crisis due to trauma. And from that experience, I experienced so many losses in my life. And they weren't losses around death necessarily, but rather non-death related losses. So things like a loss of purpose, a loss of meaning, a loss of identity, loss of community, loss of relationships, uh, loss of trust in the world. And so that was where I started my journey. And that actually led me to pursue a formalized education in my undergrad in thanatology and philosophy. So as you can tell, I was a pretty existentially twisted 21 or 21-year-old going into philosophy. And then thanatology, a lot of people don't know what that word is. So that's the study of death, dying, grief, and bereavement. And so thanatology as a field, it kind of looks at how these experiences shape and mold us as human beings. And so it's a very interdisciplinary field. So there's a lot of professionals in thanatology. So I'm a certified thanatologist now with the Association for Death Education and Counseling. And so, I work in my community as a grief and trauma therapist, but other people who are thanatologists might be people who are like funeral directors, not-for-profit bereavement workers. They could be teachers, researchers, academics, nurses, medical physicians, and so forth. So it's a very interdisciplinary field. And from my undergraduate program, I then did 2 master's degrees. And one of those master's degrees was in counseling psychology. And that's how I became a psychotherapist in Ontario.
Wow. I'm wondering because I know other people like in entertainment that I came up with that get these sort of like honorary doctors or master's degrees like in like, music theater or acting or whatever for the work they've done. I'm like, I wonder if I been just to the left of death enough times to be an honorary psychologist? Probably not. Um, no, I'm so excited to have you here because and I'm going to, true to form, just obviously keep riffing like an everyday person and just let you sort of battle the professional side of this. But yeah, no, it's really cool to have you, especially for this conversation. And I think I told you offline originally, I come from my background in building the world's first like men's peer support app. So like no short of sort of peer support specialists that I could have like called on and dragged out here for their knowledge. And then when we spoke the first time, I was like, that's just such a cool way to do it, to just have the actual experience of both sides of this equation, like just a lived experience expert and a peer and, a true professional in this field, who works with people every day in that way. And I think there's a bit of a challenge because in everyday life, grief can kind of seem so normal that it's not something that you'd seek help for. Like the way that it's sort of set up and the way the rituals are around it, it's usually 2 to 3 days paid bereavement leave, usually the what I'd call the administration or the formal honoring of a death, in my experience has always kind of happened within a week or 2 weeks, the funeral, whatever services you're going to have, that sort of all wraps up. And with that, sometimes the condolences, the support, the casseroles, all those things start to fade away. And it's always weirdly timed as the flowers wilt, that like real rush of support, kind of starts to fade away a little bit. And people really kind of start to look at, okay, what is my life like now? What support do I truly have? And what kind of extra support might I be looking to get? So that's really where I'm coming from today. But I'm cheating and I'm missing a part of the show that I ask every guest. So I have to ask you before we dive into all that. And this is kind of weird because I feel like you get to cheat in response because I've never asked someone with your credentials this, but I ask everybody if someone walked up to you on the street and said, "What's grief?" or a child that just didn't really know what that word was yet, how would you explain it to them?
Sure. Well, I would say really quite simply, grief is the natural response to loss and adjustment. And loss is really any experience in life where it's impossible to go to life as it once was. So there's been a permanent change in circumstances, perception, or your experience of something. And so loss is really whatever a person says it is. It can be related to death, but it's also related to non-death related experiences, like I was describing in my own personal story. And so the word bereavement, if you've heard of that word, it basically means to like be deprived of something. And so that you can be deprived of a person or a pet, but you could also be deprived of like a relationship or
Mhm.
an experience or an object, right? So it's actually like bereavement is that deprivation from something that's subjectively valued by a person.
Hmm. Well, you
Yeah.
are the right guy to ask that question. It's
Did I do
interesting because people, yeah, and,
good?
people freeze up with that question a lot and sort of, well, I don't know. And it's like, well, welcome to Grief Club, the podcast. Did you think I might ask you what
Yeah.
you think of grief? But it's weird how even then, even in that instance, how sometimes we're like, oh, well, yeah, what is it? And it's beautiful to get people sort of thinking, working through it as they say it, definitions, and then it's equally as helpful and beautiful to have you say it, in that way. And I'm such a big champion of everyone having their own sort of living, breathing constitution of grief for them, like what their definition is, so that it can help them. And mine, although it's living and breathing, has really hovered around, the loss of anything that's meaningful in the process that follows it. That's sort of my, you know, and I just love that you said that. And I want to point out now, in case I forget later, that you are an amazing asset and contributor to Psychology Today articles on grief specifically, and that's how we actually connected, was that article on non-death grief, and I bring that up a lot because I often feel like my story, it's so easy to look in at these deaths, and it's almost like a movie. It's something people understand, and there was these formal processes and support that came from them, because people sort of, when a father dies, when a brother dies, when there's an accident, there's just this societal way of showing up, But there was all these people throughout my 20s when I was going through all that were going through these non-death griefs, or as I call them in the book, like micro grief processes. And not because they're smaller, just because we have to remind ourselves to kind of take a microscope and look at like where these losses have occurred and where that deprivation occurs, and a lot of us either naturally skip through it. We're not taught to acknowledge those. There's no ritual around that. So oftentimes, like I would really feel and have so much empathy for somebody even who is dealing with like a really, really tough breakup. Because to them, it also, and even my own breakups at the same time, is navigating the grief around death. Like I would find that it was almost harder when it felt like something I could change. I knew I couldn't bring my loved ones back from the dead. And so even though, trust me, I tried, I did all the begging and bargaining that one does. But, I knew that was sort of like, the hard rule there. And it's a lot harder, say, with an ex or an old job. We go, look, how could I change? How could I be good enough to get this back? To get rid of this grief that I'm feeling, and sometimes I really do think that it can almost be more difficult in a way, to grieve an intangible like that, especially because there's no ritual around it, there's no acknowledgement generally around it. It's totally up to you to share, and and sometimes you'll even get people literally saying, well, at least no one's dead. You'll literally get that response to something like that. So, and I've been bad for saying that, sort of, not to anyone else, but even to myself. I go, well, at least it's not that. And then you're cutting into that grief process and honoring that.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. And I think you highlighted a couple really key points there that a lot of people go through, which is like grief. One of the reasons why it's so hard is that it's become like a socially awkward conversation in society. And so, as you were saying, we often don't have a lot of these rituals or ways to actually categorize some of our these really disorienting experiences that we're going through, right? Like there's no funeral when you look into the mirror and you don't recognize yourself anymore, right? Like people don't have a ritual for that, for example. And as you were talking about grief, because it's also become like it's become so uncomfortable for so many people and they don't know what to say, they can say something really disenfranchising or really invalidating around well, at least someone didn't die, or at least you still have your other arm, or like
Mm.
and that's just so not helpful. And we've really become disconnected from our roots around grief and loss as a society. I mean, this in so many different human cultures and places around the world, like this was like grief was a time for community, right?
Mm.
But we've become much more isolated and alienated in our grieving experiences, particularly over COVID. And people are more lonely than ever in some ways, right? Like there's this great sort of paradox around like something like the internet, how we can become so much more connected to one another, and yet here we are feeling sometimes more alone, more isolated, and more disconnected from everyone at the same time. So this is a tough time to actually, I think, for anyone to go through any type of significant loss. We really live in a grief phobic world.
Yeah, I totally agree. And to be honest, that's what kind of gave me the final push to write the book and to get involved again was COVID. I mean, when I just was like all around me, it felt like everybody was grieving and nobody knew what to call it. It was the first time after this like hyper isolating, coming of age of always kind of being in these whirlwinds of grief and no one else getting it, or thinking they could never get it or saying, oh, that sounds impossible, to suddenly everyone I knew was navigating the loss of something meaningful. Every single person. There was like, it was finally like we were all in grief club in a way, whether we liked it or not. And it was just this like calling for me, like where I stopped freezing because usually the grief conversation was so much around death and my personal experiences around death. And suddenly it was this societal thing, that was just happening for everyone and anyone all at the same time. And it was just, yeah, it was palpable at that time. I mean, everybody in some way was navigating the loss of something meaningful. So that really highlighted it, and I feel like it's really opened up. It has a lot of conversations around grief. I get that a Google alert for any time grief is mentioned in like an article or a podcast, or and that definitely went up tenfold, during those times. It was just suddenly, it was something that people were really addressing. And it was the first time where everybody didn't have the right to the even normal, you know, services that might happen when a death occurred. The right to gather was, even that we were grieving, the right to gather when we were grieving, it's just never, obviously I've never seen anything like that in my 33 years, but I think for many people, even speaking generationally to grandparents and mentors, it was something that other than in like a wartime setting, it hadn't really happened, so it was a really interesting time. And it's a good sort of segue because I think it did really force us all to look at what support is for each of us and also who we trust in our support circles. I think the numbers for therapy and therapy apps even like went way up obviously during the last 2 years as well. It's just a time where whether we liked it or not, it was like being locked in a room and forced to kind of face yourself. And if you hadn't grieved or you had skipped some of those grief processes we were talking about because society didn't nudge you to, suddenly you were feeling all of them at once, and or still are as we sort of come back to whatever new normals we're, adjusting to at this time, even a few years later. So I'd love to put it to you how you sort of define the separation in relationships between what's peer support, and then what's professional support.
Sure. Yeah. So for me, like when I think of peer support or just grief support more broadly, what I think is so great is that anyone can do this who basically just cares. And in fact, we should be encouraging, like grief support within the community. And so, like, this is something that belongs within families, the community, our schools, our religious organizations. This is something that we can all do for one another. And grief support is really just about normalizing grief. It's about creating an environment and space where people can just openly share their experiences. You don't have to be a licensed and trusted mental health professional to facilitate grief support. A lot of grief support groups are just led by people who have lived experience with grief around a particular loss. So yeah, so grief and peer support is really, it focuses a lot more on the present moment, what's coming up for people, talking about it, connecting with one another. And it's very, yeah, there's a real focus on just validating the grieving experience. And that's so some of that happens a little bit in grief therapy, but grief therapy is quite different.
You've reached Grief Club. Leave a message after the beep.
Hey, Grief Club, it's me again. Yeah, I know you probably thought you were going to get a break from listening to me talk, but I just wanted to check in and find out how I'm doing. I mean, really, you can be really honest with me. I'm like a different Addison from the Addison that's recording in this episode because this is recorded at a different time. So you can tell me the truth. The best way to do that is to leave a review and like the podcast, but only if you like it. I really think it will help other people who need it find it. So I greatly appreciate you doing that. Back to me. And for me, definitely, sometimes you get caught up on who should be the most supportive or, in a family unit or in the way life is set up. And I just want to always kind of nudge people to just look at what feels the most supportive for you and who really shows up for you. And, that's probably the center of your peer support, and then it sort of branches from there. But it can really be anybody, who you're not formalizing a relationship around, help for. And I think one thing that came up as you were talking, which is sort of the flip, I find that when I'm struggling with my grief too, for the people in Grief Club that are listening to this, I suddenly feel like there's no way I could peer support somebody else. I suddenly feel like incapable, even though on other days I would pride myself on being quite good at that, given my experience and how much I've sort of delved into that. But I think that the one thing for me, when I think of peer support now, what I automatically think is of the supporter asking, what does support look like for you right now? Like that has just always been my golden go back to of like, if you're on either side of the support equation and you're feeling stuck or inadequate, or, you can always ask what support looks like for the person that you're supporting. And it's also something that I've learned to arm the people who I trust to support me through my hard moments with, on that peer support side. It's just you don't have to try to come up with an answer. You don't have to fix, it's like sometimes we're reading these books and we're like trying not to fix anything and honor what comes up. And then we've got everyone around us trying to, patchwork and fix us. I think of like the scarecrow being put back together, like in The Wizard of Oz, it's like, I'm trying to honor that my insides are everywhere right now, and support just looks like you being okay with it too sometimes, just sitting here with me. So I love that. So if somebody is kind of, sitting there and the experiment of this week was to kind of make a list of who you have in your life, who you consider to be a peer support, and what you have in terms of professional support, whether it's doctors, coaches, counselors, whatever it is. When does someone typically come to somebody like you, or how would you, I don't know, acknowledge when that search for a little bit of extra help might come into play?
Sure, yeah. So, you know, there's a couple different reasons that might come up for someone about maybe why they might want to see a grief and bereavement therapist like myself, okay? And so one of those reasons might be that simply they just want more additional support in their life. And that's a fantastic reason, okay?
Mhm.
So not everybody, like we were talking about, has access to the peer support, or they have a supportive family, or maybe their ethnic or religious or cultural background doesn't actually provide a framework for how to deal with the situation that's coming up for them. And so if people are feeling really lonely, isolated, disconnected from other people in their grief, I mean, connecting with a grief therapist can be a wonderful point of connection. So that would be one point. Another one might be if you are experiencing grief, but there's a large degree of overlap with trauma. Okay. And so, I mean, I think it's important to name that grief is fundamentally a heartbreaking, disorienting experience, and you will have many bad days. You might have a couple good days too, but there may be more bad than good at the beginning. But despite this being a disorienting experience and consisting of so many different, like a wide range of emotional and cognitive processes, like if you find though that you're feeling deeply immobilized in your life, or you feel really paralyzed or stuck, and maybe you're struggling with some everyday functioning, like you can't get out of bed, you can't brush your teeth anymore, you're not sleeping, you're struggling with intrusive thoughts, perhaps you're having panic attacks or crippling anxiety, maybe you're feeling suicidal, or you have concerns around substance use, if you feel like your life is pointless and meaningless, these could all be, or just like a prolonged state of shock or numbness, right? And so if you find that you're experiencing a lot of these intensive symptoms, and like you're really just like suffering and just feel immobilized in some way, that you don't have that fluid range of responses, and you feel really, your grief feels really rigid and overwhelming, then maybe it's a good idea to reach out to a psychotherapist as well.
I love that. And there's it's always such a mixture of things. I mean, I'm such a big, champion and encourager. Is that a word? Encourager? Wow, I need to revisit speaking 101 after this. Even if it is a word, I still couldn't say it. So that's, something to look at. But, of a mixture of things. I call it my mental health mixtape, and also one thing we kind of said offline going in is it's always beautiful to set up relationships like this proactively or at a time in your life where it's not in reaction to something that feels so overwhelming, to have that baseline of whatever relationship you might have with a mental health professional, or the therapeutic practice that exists already in the day to day before it's like okay, I'm in the water now, and we need to swim kind of thing. And I can definitely say for me that was something that, obviously, like you said, if trauma is introduced, there's no way to know that, there's no way to call that. But when I had the existing relationships with certain people and then went into, certain challenges, it did help that it wasn't like all new at once. It is something that somebody can start to look at. But of course, that's, easier said than done. Sometimes the life events and the losses are what propel us to, advocate for ourselves and find the help we need.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And like I was saying, like this is just, it's a fundamentally disorienting experience, right? And it is important to also name that many people don't have to or need to see a grief therapist. Because grief, like I said earlier, it is the natural response to loss, right? Like grief it really is this instinctual process where, that loss of meaning occurs, whatever that is, as you might define that. And then, our inner world from this significant loss experience, it can kind of explode, it can shatter, and it can, it falls apart, right? And so what is grief really? Like, grief is about learning how to pick up all those pieces and to glue your inner world again, right? To rebuild those fundamental assumptions about yourself, other people, the world more broadly. And not everybody needs to see a grief therapist to do that. But some people do need that support, right? And they do need that help to help facilitate their their natural and instinctive grieving process, because things like trauma can actually really inhibit that natural response. Or people who experience a lot of shame around their grief and loss from other people socially, that can really compound an already difficult and like what might feel like an impossible situation already. So those are some of the things to look out for, where thinking about, okay, maybe I do need to see a therapist, or maybe I don't.
I love that you hit on that, and it really brings up for me that, and this is with retrospect years later looking back, but with each of the three sort of major losses that I navigated, those deaths, it's interesting because it can sort of be diluted down to sort of this rule that was broken from my old way of being that I couldn't reconcile. So with my brother, it had a lot to do with him being my younger brother, and it just out of order and not able to protect. And, there was all these rules I had obviously made up in my own programming, and in my relationship to him. And very similarly with my father and losing a father to suicide, this rule of that, he would protect me from this, and sort of this is the one scenario where that's sort of an asterisk because of where it is, and just even this idea of like, but I did the right thing, I did the right thing, I did the right thing, and it's so interesting. And sometimes, I mean, people might not admit this publicly, but I will. But sometimes the thing you repeat when you cry, when you have one of those good hard cries, it's that lesson or that thing that you didn't realize the child inside of you was just like really upset that this rule or this law that you thought existed could even be broken, and it's just sometimes it's an invitation to just be so much more gentle, I guess, with ourselves too, because you're like, oh, okay. Like, yeah, you did do everything right. You absolutely did, and it's just totally different. I mean, than the way that, at least I probably speak to myself on a day-to-day basis, because we're not really getting to those core wounds. But it is interesting how, as over time there is like this sort of rule or few rules that got broken when you experience that loss, and for you they may have been like rules that just could not be broken. Like it sort of breaks your brain. Like that's how I kind of always say it, it's a different operating
Absolutely.
system.
Absolutely, yeah. And like one of those rules that gets broken that I see a lot in grief therapy is people come in and they realize that bad things happen to good people.
Mm,
And they thought their whole life, right? If I'm a good person, then good things will happen. But that's not true. We live in a world of change, transition, and impermanence. And bad things happen to good people all the time, and it can just shatter those assumptions, or these beliefs, or these rules that we're talking about.
mm. Yeah, that I had to let go of that one for sure, because I would not have gotten very far. And it's like I would make jokes. I'd be like, "What was I, Hitler in my last life?" Like what's going on here? But it's hard to shake that, because there's just so much safety around why we built little rules like that for ourselves, and so it feels very unsafe for the thing to help you heal to also sometimes be the thing that really unravels you a little bit about how you live your life, and for me, for instance, with my father's suicide, my biggest form of acceptance came from when I fell into my own suicidal depression, and when I came as close as I did to that similar moment. Once I got out of it, I actually felt, a lot more ease, because I really understood the mindset of where he was at, and everything I thought from my normal sort of healthy 25 to 27-year-old brain about what was going on in those moments for my father, like suddenly, it made sense. It wasn't any of that, and it's just
Mhm.
some of those really weird things that what you're accepting almost sometimes feels scarier and more unhealthy, but it does lead to a healthier relationship with yourself within grief, sometimes it's scarier to admit that anybody can die by suicide than to have a very specific reason why this happened, because it opens it up for you as well. It's this very interesting thing of like, well, if I accept that, then there's this part of us that goes, no, I'll never be like that, and that you think it's keeping us safe, I'll never feel that unhealthy. And it's like, in order to fully love and accept my dad post passing, I have to accept that that's possible for anybody, with certain pressures and that where your mental health is at and how much you're able to care for it or not care for it, that's just something that becomes very possible. But I really tried to never accept that for a long time. It felt like a threat to me to accept it, And then of course later, you guys probably in your coffee room would laugh at things like this, where it's like, yep, and then he got it. It took 2 years, but then it clicked, that was freedom in a way.
Yeah, well, yeah, I just so appreciate you saying this because, your story highlights how it was through this grieving process that you actually relearned how to figure out, like, to make new beliefs, right? To make new rules for yourself, right? That are a little bit more wiser. Because, while we talk about that grief is a natural response to loss, it's also, I mean, grief is a largely unconscious process. Like these core assumptions that we're making throughout our lives, I mean, this is given to us by this all of our life experiences and the society we live in, right? And it's not like people are explicitly telling us these things. We end up internalizing the world around us, right? And so what's so great about your story, Addison, is that you really highlight how by actually actively engaging with your own process of suffering, it can actually be really transformative. And that's something that actually some therapists even kind of struggle with. So some therapists, and this is something to look out for, is that they view grief, for example, as a rational problem to be solved. But unfortunately, you can't think your way out of grief. There's no quick, easy solutions to grief, as you were
Yeah, I'm
describing
nodding. I'm like, trust
accurately.
me, my hyperactive brain tried to think my way out of all of it. And I just ended up burnt out, exhausted. And yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I talk about
Yeah.
that all the time. I started celebrating that I had fixed my grief. I had thought my way out of it. I had, gone to the ends of the earth and figured it out, kind of thing. And obviously shortly after was when the third event happened, and it was just so obvious when I laid in that hospital bed that without the ability to run, distract, and take my thoughts elsewhere, I hadn't really fixed anything. I had just avoided honoring what was really going on in so many ways. So yeah, that's it. I'd love to give anyone listening this, just that sort of like, it's like, oh, that's not bad. Like, oh, it's okay. And if you're acknowledging for the first time that you try to think your way out of, feeling through your grief or living with your grief or however you want to say it, navigating your grief, I think that's obviously just such a natural human tendency to think your way out of what seems like a problem that needs to be solved. And it's the essence of all of my interest in all of my work, is like, just if I can speed people up a little bit and say, skip the 5 years where you try to fix this by like thinking into a solution, kind of thing, rather than showing up to it each day and making choices around it, because I mean, you will try. I tried. Tried.
Yeah, and you're not the only one, Addison. Like I told you, I have a background in philosophy, right? Like I definitely tried to think my way out of this, and I turned to all these old dead white guys to see what wisdom they had for me around this experience. And it turns out that there's actually nothing that can really prepare you for grief, right?
Mm.
No amount of education or research, even as now as a therapist, like, I'm not immune to the effects of grief or loss like anyone else. And they continue to be deeply disorienting experiences for myself as well. But this is why I think that grief it's really this process of relearning how to live in a post-loss world. It really is a time where we engage with one of the deepest aspects of our humanity, and we figure out how to make sense when nothing makes sense. And there's really nothing that can spare you from this experience, nothing that can fully prepare you. And it's one of those things that you just have to go through it. And it's this, you have to really, feel your way through this. You have to really touch base with yourself and all the aspects of you and in your wholeness, right? Because like grief and bereavement, it penetrates us to our core, right? So it's fundamentally a very holistic or multidimensional experience, right? It shows up physically, emotionally, cognitively, psychologically, socially, spiritually, existentially, and so forth. So it's something that requires you attend to with your entire being. And of course, this can also be so difficult, not just because it's so painful and disorienting. There's that part, but we also live in a world where most of us, if we were raised up in a Western industrial nation, we've been told since we were just little kiddos to like pull up our bootstraps, go to work, and get a job, and no matter what, like you do that job, right? And as you said, like if people only have 2 to 3 days off for bereavement leave, well, that's only for death related losses. People don't get grief days for if they've experienced like their relationship is dissolving, or that doesn't extend if their pet dies, or it doesn't extend if they've just experienced like a loss of faith, or maybe they just lost their home and they have to move. You know what I mean? And so that's really dependent on workplace policies, but at a more macro systems level, we don't have a lot of support for grieving and bereaved people. And that can really compound an already disorienting situation and make it feel even more impossible too.
I agree completely. And I hope this episode and whether they're reading or not, like the chapter, like the whole idea around the experiment is not to overwhelm, but to assess, just overall where you're at, who you have to support you, where you might like more support. I even suggest doing like a mental health check-in or screening of some sort, either online or in person, and that you don't have to do anything with the knowledge that comes from that, but it's just the practice of checking in and sort of arming yourself with just the awareness of, oh, okay, I could look for that, or like it's just because it can be such a scary thing to kind of assess or become aware of how much or little support or what we feel we need and what we have, all those things. And it's almost like doing a budget. Like we always do kind of feel better after once but it's like for some reason you believe if you just put it off, then like you're putting off the stress, but it doesn't really work that way, does it? It's like
No, it would be so nice if it did, though.
It really would. It really would. So if you were to put, one tool in a grief club member's toolkit, something tangible they could take away from today when maybe they're feeling overwhelmed, or something like tactical that you kind of have and you use with your people, what might you offer?
Yeah. Well, I would say to create an environment where you can give yourself permission to grieve. I mean, that fundamentally is the most important thing. A lot of us don't give ourselves permission to grieve, and that pressure can come from ourselves. It can come from our places of work, it can come from family or friends or our broader community. But to actually like grief really invites slowness, and it invites learning how to be with our pain, learning how to be with our suffering. And so I think people who can kind of facilitate an environment that will support them going into their grief and also going out, and going in and going out, because there's a real ebb and flow to grief. It's not static. You're not going to be in misery every single second of the day. And you're also not going to be in joy every second of the day. there's a real oscillation that occurs in grief, right? Like there's good moments and there's bad moments. And so just giving yourself permission to be able to lean into your pain and to attend to those growing edges that, that grief can often invite us to attend to. It can be a really transformative experience for people.
Mm. And if someone finds themselves sort of in complete overwhelm, hyperventilating, I mean, we've all been there where just, grief's really taken over, and, well honoring and processing what's coming up. Is there a certain grounding tool or technique, like a favorite that you have, or something that, people can do in their cars or at their desks at those moments when it just seems there's no way I can catch my calm here, and I'm in a public place, or, whatever it may be.
For sure. Yeah. Well, it's amazing how just, for example, connecting to our breath can help us really reground and orient ourselves to things like calmness and safety. And so, there's so many different breathing techniques out there, but one that I love is just box breathing, or what's called diaphragmatic breathing.
They've heard that
Just
one
like,
before. That's why I'm
yes.
smiling. I'm like,
Okay,
but I
great.
love whenever it comes up, because it really does seem too simple. And if I just keep saying it over and over again, then it's like, well, he just keeps going to breathing because he doesn't know anything else. But it really, it is the number one tool when people ask me, like, what's been the number one tool, and it does seem too simple. But and I, like we were talking about, either with the overthinking, I every night I'm like, are you kidding? Your box breaths aren't going to get us to sleep. Like I have the argument with myself, like literally last night, where it's just like, enough with the breaths, and I'm like, okay, but we know they work, and they do work, and it's like, so it is interesting how it does seem too simple, but in a way, almost everybody, that's the first thing they come back and say, is just, that our biggest tool is built right into our chest in a way, and it's the tuning
Oh,
in.
yeah. Yeah. Well, like that's it. Breath is life, right? In the most basic sense. And our whole, like, biological functioning as humans takes place around, breathing, sleeping, and digesting. Like those are the cornerstones of human functioning, right? So
Hmm.
just tapping into those basic things can be really supportive.
Hmm. Yeah, we'll drop the novelty seeking, no, what's the next big thing that will, cure me and save me. It's always difficult when it's simple, just like, oh, nutrition and breathing. All right, all right.
Yeah.
Um, God, this has been great. As I round out, I always just like to kind of, for my own personal way of doing this, diving into grief every week, is ending with this idea of asking guests how they find the funny in their life. Like either what makes you laugh, or what was the last thing that made you laugh, or what's the funniest thing about grief for you. But where do you find the funny?
Where do I find the funny? Well, I would just say I kind of have like a philosophy of funny, I guess, which is that, like, humor in my life and in the lives of many people I support, like it helps us reframe things like grief or death as something other than terror. And so a lot of people are surprised when, like they might come into grief therapy, for example, and, like they might really go into, their sadness, and they might be crying. But at the end of the session, we might also be having a good laugh.
Mm,
And so, and people are surprised by that. And they're like, well, how does that happen? Well, it happens because people are funny. And you don't stop being funny when, like, you're grieving, right? And the more that people deepen their relationship to things like grief, like the more positive memories that you start like connecting to. And
mm,
so you just kind of find these, like, you don't even have to like necessarily look for them. Sometimes you can, but they just come up to you, like these funny stories you had about the person who died. And so many grieving people, as a therapist, they want to have a space where they can tell their story, right, and not be judged. And so I hear just some of the most hilarious stories. And if you were to walk by my office, you would just expect to hear people crying, and yeah, sure, that happens sometimes, but you'd also hear people laughing, and that's because there's a real life energy to grief.
Yeah,
And
no,
yeah.
I love that. And it speaks very true of myself and just my family dynamic as a whole. And probably 8 times out of 10, if you walked by my therapy or coaching session, you'd hear some sort of hysterical laughter. I find for me it's a catalyst. It just really it gets me there a lot faster. It connects me to the truth of the truth if I can find what's funny about it, because often what's funny to me about it is like the realest bit of it, and just like how real it is. I would have loved for you with your paleontology degree, and but well, nothing. There's no laughter in death, Addison. That's what I was like, hoping you. Well, nothing.
Yeah, well, yeah. And this is how I like to define thanatology, as, and some other people in my profession do this too, which is it's the study of life with death left in. And this is it. It's not about the people who aren't drawn to this. We're not goths. We're not, like necessarily obsessed with like the horror genre or anything. Like it's not this dark, gloomy, depressive thing, but it's actually just about recognizing how things like grief, dying, death, loss, change, and transition, these are all normal and natural parts of life. And so when you think about these things, it's actually like, oh, okay. So yeah, they're tough, painful experiences, but like they're also a part of life, and they actually can help us live a more intentional life, because we can recognize that something like life is a finite resource, and that can actually be really grounding and help us live with a lot of integrity, and make the most of our time, and rebuild these lives of depth, wholeness, and meaning as human beings. And that's certainly what I try to do as a grief therapist.
I love that. And also just for me, I like it when you said that. I'm like, yeah, this is like death with the laughter left in, which so many people feel the need to take out. It's like for me, that's like so important that the whole experience is there. And so, well, you've just justified me being able to finish every episode with me wanting to find a way to laugh so that I don't have to sit in depth all the time. So that works for me. But it's so true. I mean, it's all part of all of it, life, and it's all part of that. So why take the laughter out of death? I love that. I'm gonna use that, I think. Even though that's not what you said, but I just instantly translated into how can I still make jokes about death and dying and feel okay about it. If people want to find you, where do they find you?
Sure. Yeah.
Not
So
your address.
yeah,
They want to learn more.
yeah,
They
I
want to read these articles I
gotcha.
mentioned.
Yeah. So on Psychology Today, my blog is called Navigating the Serpentine Path of Life. Or you could check out my website, which is just my name. So it's www.markshelvock.com. That's MarkShelvock. And yeah, I would love to hear from you and connect. And yeah, and just thank you so much, Addison, for having me on this podcast today. I'm glad that we could demonstrate just how very organically, like when we start talking about grief and loss, like, today kind of started a little bit heavier. It was kind of intense, but it also ends with a sense of relief and a sense of joy and a sense of connection, a sense of laughter. I think that's just such a beautiful example of what like the grieving experience is kind of like it's very dynamic, and it just
I agree.
flows.
Yeah, no, it's exactly true. Just two Canadians talking about life with death left in, that's all this is. As we close off today, one word for how you're feeling now.
I would say I'm feeling really content.
I'm going to go with connected. And that's another one done. Thank you so much for being here today. And Grief Club, we'll see you soon. Well, Grief Club, that's the show. If you enjoyed it, please let us know by liking and leaving a review. This will help as many people who may need what we're talking about find it the fastest. Remember to honor the journey, and when that gets tough, find the funny.